Okay, I think we'll let these people in. And
there we go. It looks much better.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. I apologize to everyone for this. We had a little technical issue, which is seems to be a feature of our lives nowadays. But in any case, let me thank all of you and wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you for being here. And let me first of all welcome all of you who have decided to join, and especially to our speakers. We have certainly three, or at least to me, very familiar faces, which I'm very happy to see, and which has been a while since I've seen them live, or without a face mask at least. So it's a real delight to see you all. And let me once again thank all of you for being here. This is a first in a series of discussions which we as Atlantic Forum are currently running as part of a brand new discussion series called NATO 2030, which is trying to focus on transatlantic relations and NATO. And our aim really is to provide a platform for up-and-coming experts across the transatlantic area to discuss sort of the opportunities and the challenges in transatlantic relations, NATO's continued adaptations to evolving threats and to the evolving threat environment, but also to explore new ideas for how to strengthen the transatlantic bond. And I'm very glad that all of you are here. Also, many of you are patrons of the Atlantic Forum. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the Atlantic Forum, we are a NGO run by young professionals, which has been set up back in 2009, specifically with the intention of engaging the next generation of transatlantic leaders and engaging with public on questions of transatlantic relations and the enduring importance of NATO. So this is sort of one of multiple activities that we do, and also in terms of this discussion series, which is going to be taking place every sort of 3 weeks, trying to zoom in on a specific issue. We hope to turn it into a long-term series, eventually also make it more of a hybrid to have live meetings, at least we hope to do that the day we all get out of our pajamas, which will hopefully be very soon. And to also meet many of you online as well as offline. But I'm delighted that we have this very first discussion, which is sort of trying to take stock of transatlantic relations from both sides of the Atlantic. We want to discuss in the next hour or so the transatlantic agenda of the new administration in the DC. Also, also discuss the European perspective, or certainly from the different parts of Europe, and look ahead in terms of how we can all work together and try to reinvigorate the transatlantic bond, because I think that's something which all of us, not just the current political leaders, but all of us have a role to play. So I really hope this is something where we can discuss, but also, I hope, taking things forward, also work together. So I'm really excited to have three, I should also say friends, actually, as speakers in this first series. We have Niklas Novaky, who's a research officer at the Wilfried Martens Center here in Brussels. We have Carisa Nietsche, who's the Associate Fellow of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Good morning, Carisa. Thank you, and good to see you again.
Good morning.
And we also have Ulrik Smed, who's the co-coordinator of the NATO 2030 Young Leaders. Thank you, Ulrik. Thanks, Carisa. Thanks, Niklas. Great to see you all. Now, I know we've already taken quite a lot of time, so I don't want to take more time from the moderators. So maybe I'll jump right in, and I'll start with you, Carisa, actually. Because, I mean, the last 4 years of transatlantic relations have been turbulent, to say the least. And I know that may sound like a cliche, but it's a cliche I think we can all agree on, whether rightly or wrongly. And I would just like to hear maybe from you about what you think in sort of the legacy of the previous administration in terms of transatlantic relations, but maybe also if you can tell us, because lots of the issues that also the Trump administration brought forward, some of them were also outstanding issues also, which were highlighted by administrations before that. So I was wondering whether you can perhaps tell us about some of the legacy that you feel sort of important to highlight from the previous administrations, but also some of the more long-term issues that we've had also before that.
Absolutely. So I think that if we are looking back on the Trump years and thinking about what his legacy might be, there are three critical policy areas where Trump has probably the most lasting impact and honestly damage. The first is the discussion around the 2% spending goal. Now, this is nothing new. This was, of course, brought up by the Bush administration, by the Obama administration, and they had always emphasized the importance of the alliance's commitment at the Wales summit and Bush pre-Wales times. But what was always critical with these past administrations, especially under Obama, is there was an emphasis on the within a decade part of that commitment. When Trump came to office from day one, he wanted allies to have met that commitment yesterday. So I think that that is one critical issue. The second is the trade war with Europe that Trump launched. Trade tensions aren't new. If we remember back to TTIP, we were all talking about chlorinated chicken for a really long time. If we zoom even to the present day, the decade-long Boeing Airbus dispute over subsidies has been raging for quite some time. But what changed was Trump's obsession with and tunnel vision on trade deficits. And this changed the United States' trade calculation with respect to Europe. And this led to the imposition of the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. And this has shifted, I think, the United States' trade policy with Europe. And I have no doubts that the Biden administration would not have chosen those policies for itself. But I do think in some ways, Trump has boxed in the Biden administration on some of these trade issues, which I can talk about a little bit more later. The third issue that I think was really critical in the transatlantic relationship and part of Trump's legacy is China. And I think that this really represents a missed opportunity. Europe was very willing, very excited to potentially be part of the US's phase one trade deal with China. And I think that Trump really admonished allies, castigated allies, brushed them aside, and really wanted them to have no part of any kind of US-China great power competition. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, as we look at what a Biden strategy might look like. But I do think we'll see a very significant shift where allies will be considered an advantage. They will not be brushed aside as they have been in the Trump administration. Overall, I think that Trump's real legacy, aside from these three policy issues, is the tone and tenor of the transatlantic relationship has significantly changed. This was a president who called the European Union a foe, often referred to free riders. And I think that that legacy is what looms the largest in the relationship and is something that Biden will really have to come to grips with and really have to take into consideration as he's setting his policy agenda for the next 4 years.
Absolutely, and that actually brings me to Niklas. Niklas, as Carisa also talked about, Trump viewing the EU as a foe. How do you? And I think this important. The question of transatlantic unity is absolutely important when we look at the developments over the last few years. So what impact do you think actually the differences within NATO actually had on transatlantic unity? On one hand, we have this issue of, as Carisa said, of US versus Europe, but we also have different perceptions of the Trump administration, even within Europe, and of course divisions also within the European NATO on wider issues as well. And then we also have the question of Greece and Turkey over the last few years as well. So I wonder if you can also tell us a little bit more about a lot of the sort of the wider picture of the broader scale of these differences within NATO, and how lasting actually do you think they are?
Thanks a lot, Igor, and many thanks for the invitation to be here. I think one of the key consequences of these tensions and differences that we've had, like not just within NATO, but within the broader transatlantic relationship since Trump came into office, is the significant enhancement of the European Union's kind of strategic autonomy agenda as well. And what I mean by this is that I think in Brussels, as well as in many European capitals, like although not in all, because I mean there was a good amount of countries as well that like clearly benefited from Trump and viewed him as an ally, as a strong ally. But in traditional like leaders of the European Union, like France, Germany, the attitude they got from the White House was rather different to what they were used to, and especially like what Carisa already mentioned about them hearing that the European Union is a foe. Germany especially like got a handful from the Trump administration. Macron like seems to be doing a bit better with the Trump White House, but it was still a tough time. I don't think this is, we'll see kind of what the really kind of lasting consequences are, but I think, like I said, that the Europe's own kind of autonomy agenda and will certainly like be boosted or continue to be prominent, because the expectation now is that although we now have a friendly face in the White House in the form of Joe Biden, and there are many very familiar people in the various departments that are in charge of transatlantic relationships in the United States, it might be possible that, I mean, the next president will again be somebody more in the mold of Donald Trump, which means that like Europe has to kind of then watch out for its own like security a little bit more, like regardless of who is in the White House. But I don't think this is not really like anything too new, like within the transatlantic relationship. Like unity has always been a little bit elusive, like throughout the history of the alliance. You can look at things like the Suez crisis in the 1950s, like these constant tensions over European defense spending, the Euro missile crisis in the 1980s, the Iraq war, like Turkey's actions in the Mediterranean. I mean, there have always been like points of tensions that have made achieving transatlantic unity a little bit difficult. But this is it's a normal feature of a collective actor such as NATO that is made up of a bunch of different countries that have rather different interests, strategic cultures, and political systems as well. Well, not political systems, but I mean political leaders. And these differences, I mean, they've always kept transatlantic unity a little bit on its toes, like meaning that whenever serious points of tension or differences emerge within the alliance, I mean, then that transatlantic unity needs to be like reforged again to ensure that NATO is a vibrant, vital and active alliance that continues to be able to adapt to the challenges that it will face going forward. And this is a healthy process because it means that, I mean, the alliance is constantly adapting. But the key thing now is to kind of make sure that with the new Biden administration in the United States, like both the Europeans and the Americans do the best they can to repair the damage like that was caused under the Trump White House, to make sure that like NATO will be ready to then face the challenges that it currently does, but will also in the future. And I think things like the proposed development of a new strategic concept for NATO, which will then replace the 2010 strategic concept, would be a very good opportunity to not just take stock of these existing differences, but then also to come up with an attractive and effective agenda for transatlantic unity. Thanks.
And on the strategic concept, that's something I wanted to chip on with you a little bit later on. But let me actually jump to Ulrik. When we're talking about adaptation, because I mean, on one hand, also as Niklas rightly said, NATO has grown over the years. I mean, we now have 30 members, so of course it's natural that the 30 members are not always. It's not always just harmony. and there is always bound to be disagreement. But at the same time, NATO is also facing a rapidly changing security environment. And certainly over the last 10 years, that security environment has changed a lot. And maybe, I mean, a question for you, Ulrik. I mean, how much do you think actually NATO has responded to the changing environment? I mean, especially since we had the last strategic concept. Do you think it has shown that it is able to adapt, or do you think in many ways actually we are sort of dealing with legacy issues rather than adapting to the new threat and security environment?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Igor, and brilliant points already made here. I think there are a lot of things to discuss in here. I think first of all, on the 30 members, I think NATO has a strategic advantage in the possibility for keeping enlargement going, the open door policy, but also responsibility. And I think taking in North Macedonia and Montenegro has shown that NATO is still living up to that responsibility. If you want to be the beacon of democracy in a world of growing geopolitical competition, also on values, then you need to live up to that, basically. And not close the door. On the concept, that's a good question. I mean, it came 10 years ago, no? And kind of came at the end of an era, at the end of the era in Afghanistan and Iraq. So that way we adapted. But of course, if you are a container tanker or a tanker, you adapt slowly. And now we sort of have these instruments in the toolbox, which we will still need. But the question is, what more do we need? And I think the big change, you know, coming back to your question on adapting to changing security challenges, is that over the past 20 years, NATO, well, over the past 30 years, NATO has shifted from deterring Russia to out of area and now back to geopolitical competition, but not just with Russia. And so what's dragging us back in is first of all, a lot of stuff that we kind of already know from the Cold War: overflights of Russian bombers, energy security, Crimea, Russian interference and influence in Syria, Libya, malign influence operations and propaganda, all the stuff we kind of know on the backbone somewhere. And then we have the real new challenges, I think, which are China. And China is not a threat, it's a challenge. We are not threatened by China when it comes to the North Atlantic region and territories right now, but there's a question of economic resilience, influence through investments, export and import controls. Who would imagine? Made in China 25, technology is becoming geopolitics. So these are things that do not pertain to NATO on a daily basis, but they come up anyway. And has NATO adapted? Yes, but it takes a while to turn that tanker, and we're doing that again now. So maybe we should see these years right now as sort of, you know, we're steaming forward while we're sending out Zodiacs and scouts in every direction, 360 degrees, because we need to know that whatever we put into a new strategic concept is well worth it. And I think it will be even more so than the last strategic concept, because that was just taking NATO out of the Cold War, and now we're actually stepping into what will be the 21st century for a good while. It always changes, doesn't it? So I think what's more to come is more on values. And I think the reflection group said a lot about that, but it focused maybe on the political cohesion more than actually on the values themselves. But even though that being very, very important. But I'll stop there and hand it back to you.
Thanks. Well, actually, if you don't mind, Ulrik, I'll stick with you for a moment, because I know you will soon, you may have to shoot to a meeting. So I just want to ask you, because you've been part of this NATO 2030 Young Leaders, which has been a reflection as part of this NATO 2030 reflection process. We had this reflection group of wise men and women also from across the Transatlantic Alliance, which published a paper back in December. Now the young leaders are about to publish their paper, I believe. So I actually want to maybe ask you a little bit more on to give us perhaps your take on sort of the key takeaways from reflection group, the older reflection group, the younger, if you like, reflection group, and perhaps some issues where where you agree with one another, and but also if there are any issues that perhaps where you disagreed, or that where certain issues that you prioritize or you see more important than the reflection group itself.
Sure. Yeah, and everyone, I apologize a lot for having to shoot in a bit. We have a strategy coming out in 2 weeks, and yeah, things are crazy. But thank you very much for the time that I'm allowed here, and I think wise, yeah, hardworking maybe, but just like everyone else here, I'm sure that's what we've been. I think we had the same problem like you, trying to say, what are we actually? Are we the young, and then they're the old ones? Old people never like that. But then again, some of us are getting a little older anyway. I think,
and wiser.
And wiser. I like that one too. Anyway, I think we've had a fantastic process. Everything happened very quickly. Just to say, in October we were invited, and people, accepted the invitation, and it was an honor. And then we got a series of seminars from NATO with Assistant Secretary Generals and the Deputy Secretary General and the Policy Planning Unit, 7 of them, in fact, before Christmas, and had to work on our day jobs and then on the night jobs of making this report at the same time. We had some tough deadlines, tough Christmas, tough New Year. But I think we got there now, and we just sent a draft to NATO for some editorial feedback. Is this what leaders, can they read it, basically, yesterday? So I think we're getting there. The question I think we had was, how ambitious should we be? Everybody says moonshots and 2030, and then question is, how realistic is it at the same time? It's always a youth dilemma: be bold, and then you say, no, it's not realistic. But I think we try to find a balance where we say, we don't care if you think that this is not realistic, but in 2030, you will need it either way. You will need to do one of these things, or otherwise you will have a NATO that has not adapted at all. And so there are also some ambitions there, rather than just operational solutions. Some of them we have to be solid, when it comes to, we have sort of 5 topics that we worked with, and then we grew them a little bit. This is where I'm getting into, what our report was, and can then share a little bit on how we were different maybe. First was defense and deterrence, solid foundation. How do we do that for the North Atlantic region? How do we do it then also in a global era, which I think we're much more in. We expanded that chapter with something on resilience, because resilience is growing much more important, and we have many points on that. We also expanded it with a chapter on partnerships, which I'll get back to. But basically, we thought it was important for NATO to put itself in a position where partnerships for peace is not just for North Atlantic region anymore. It should be, even though you don't open necessarily for new members, you should at least work in a much stronger way with democracies around the world. Our second chapter was on values. Trying to be realistic but ambitious here. We've had some ideas like creating a values pledge in order for us to recommit to this, to have an annual discussion between leaders on values, and to use the pledge to do benchmarking, basically. And that will be hard, but I think we will need something like that, and you have to start somewhere, and having a discussion on this shouldn't be a problem, even though it is, right? That's why we all say, be bold, but be realistic. Then comes the external relations side of this, we can't have an alliance in 2030. I'm not saying what it is right now, which works in a million different ways with different partners, non-democratic and democratic ones. If we are moving into a geopolitical competition era, then we need to have that with us. The values need to be with us. They need to be the vanguard. Third chapter, climate. We expect a change in attitudes, I think you can say. There are some operational ideas for how you move forward when it comes to climate security, so making sure that the whole alliance is ready for that, ready for more severe weather events. But we also need NATO to do something on the footprint, the CO2 footprint, and it's doable. I mean, there are already good examples of this happening, whether it's cutting the tether fuel, as John Mattis say, or it's something else. There's stuff to do, investments that should be done, basically. Partnerships, yeah, moving a little bit beyond our mandate. This is our fourth chapter. We developed the out of area a little bit and said it's more about partnerships, because this is more than missions and operations. We are not in Afghanistan so much anymore, and we need to think broader than just putting boots on the ground somewhere and interacting with locals in different ways, which we have a lot of good lessons learned on already. Finally, technology. Where cyber and space are sort of new domains already, what's left then? Because it should be those two should really be part of defense and deterrence then. It's not new technology that way. So we've tried to focus on becoming an ethical superpower or a power of some sort, and putting NATO into that debate. If you have killer robots and AI taking over the world, you have something similar to what was the nuclear discussion back in the days, right? So NATO can't afford to develop these weapons or something akin to it and not be part of this conversation already. How do we control this? How do we do it right? How do democracies lean in here? I'll stop there when it comes to our focus, already taking a lot of time, but I think to say we have focused less on some of the standard things that the alliance needs, where the reflection group has done a lot of work on Russia, done a lot of work on arms control, and a little bit at least, and some on nuclear deterrence. We don't go so much into that area. We focus maybe more on values, also disinformation, for instance, and that way try to complement the old reflection group report. And I think we also try to make it a little more ambitious. I mean, the reflection group's report was a buffet, which I think is good, but the anticipation for us is to push a little bit and to be that truthy voice, and I think we try to do that a little bit, and in some areas we have to also say that we need a solid foundation. So I hope that was interesting, and I would love to hear some questions from everyone. I have maybe about 5 minutes, but otherwise I'm happy to just jump out, and then we pick up on them later. Maybe I'll give something in writing at some point.
Perfect. Thanks, Ulrik. And yeah, absolutely, I agree with you on on the question of values. And I mean, that's not just a question. I think within NATO, also certainly within the EU, which has similar sort of many of the same members, but also it's a broader question also among democracies about how we are also dealing with the non-democratic world, and who actually are we, and what is it that actually binds us together, and how do we ensure that we remain consistent with our values, because not doing so certainly has its price. So I fully agree with the centrality you have there, but I just want to zoom out a little bit from NATO and sort of on the broader transatlantic relations. But before I do that, can I just say to everyone who's on Zoom, but also on Facebook, feel free to submit questions, either drop them in the chat or if you're on the floor, I'm certainly happy to give you the floor. So please feel free to start letting me know. And meanwhile, I'll just go back to Carisa actually on to talk about a bit more about the new administration in DC. I mean, in what ways do you think the new administration will represent? In what ways do you think it will represent change? In what way do you think it will represent continuity? Also, I mean, in terms of not just style, because I think that certainly that side is, I think, certainly a given, but also in terms of policy, because there's a lot of discussions also about, you know, to what extent actually the policies on certainly when it comes to Europe are actually going to differ from the way the Trump administration has been engaging. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on the change, on the continuity, I'd really appreciate that.
Absolutely. So, you know, Biden is inheriting this transatlantic relationship that is severely weakened. And in a lot of ways, that will box him in a bit. I mean, if we first look to the comprehensive agreement on investment and China policy, this is one of those issues where, you know, the European Union has made the decision. I mean, it still has to go through Parliament to approve that. But, you know, European leaders have made a decision there, and it really underscores the political context that Biden is inheriting and will have to work within. Kind of on that same note, if we look to China policy, I think this is one of those areas where we might see some continuity. You know, in his Senate confirmation hearing, President Biden's Secretary of State appointee, Tony Blinken, mentioned that he agrees with the Trump administration's, you know, pivot on China, with their more forward-leaning approach. He does disagree, of course, with how it will be done. And I think this gets to that, you know, question and that distinction that you rightly raised, Igor, about style. You know, this is going to be a night and day difference, especially on China policy. We're going to see a very multilateral approach. We're going to see the administration really lean on allies and have a genuine interest in working with them. I mean, I think it's a great signal that President Biden is waiting to meet with Xi Jinping until he's had a chance to meet with transatlantic allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to discuss what it is that we might do together. So while I think, you know, policy-wise, we'll see a very slight change from a more confrontational approach to more of a competitive approach from the Biden administration, I don't think we're going to see too earth-shattering of a difference in the actual policy outcomes. Another area where I think Biden might be boxed in a little bit is on trade. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think the administration would have decided to impose steel and aluminum tariffs on Europe. But this has become something of a political football. We have seen the US Congress, you know, and mostly battleground states and those states that really, you know, helped pave the way for Biden's victory, a little skeptical about lifting those. I mean, this is the Rust Belt. So this has become a bit of an issue in the Democratic Party of whether Biden will be able to lift those tariffs without there being some headwinds from the Democratic Party and unions in particular. There's one area where I think there will be a significant difference, and this goes back to that more multilateral approach and the importance of putting democratic values front and center in US foreign policy once again. And those two areas are export control policy and technology policy. I think we'll see a preference for multilateral and plurilateral controls in the next administration. We won't see those, you know, Friday drops of export controls that are all unilateral, where we haven't even thought through the supply chain and who else around the world, in Europe and, you know, specifically in Japan, if we're thinking about, in Korea, if we're thinking about semiconductors and other critical technologies, provide those tools. So I think that will be a big departure in this administration. The other area is technology policy. I think with this focus on values and multilateralism, it will really enable the transatlantic partners to try to pool R&D, to work together on building an affirmative agenda building their industries together, both at home and across the Atlantic. So I think that this really represents an immense opportunity to build and innovate together, and then on that same token, to really build the regulations together, to think about what does it mean for the US and Europe and democratic powers to build ethical and democratic technology and to bake those values into the technology from the get-go. The very last area where I think we'll see a very big departure is in climate change. Day one, President Biden opted to get the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that this is going to be a significant area for transatlantic cooperation and in the next, decade. So I really am excited for and optimistic about what the new administration will bring. I will say, kind of with my optimism also comes a little bit of skepticism. I do think that there are still some critical issues that the United States and Europe have in terms of their approach on certain issues. One that I think we haven't quite come to grips with are data privacy challenges. I mean, of course, we've been talking about GDPR for the past couple of years, but what we haven't really come to grips with is how this data will underpin all of these next generation technologies, including artificial intelligence. And when that, begins on the battlefield, we really have to be thinking about what this means for NATO interoperability with the transatlantic tensions on that issue. Same thing for transatlantic trade tensions, and then also for this, slightly deferring approach to China. I think we're beginning to converge, but I think we should be very clear-eyed about the fact that, just yesterday, the Biden administration released its readouts from calls with the leaders of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, acknowledging that there was a discussion about China in all of these calls. What we did notice, however, is that there wasn't that same acknowledgement. There wasn't that same mention of China in the readouts from any of those three countries. So I do think that we have a long way to go and that we should be very clear-eyed about transatlantic cooperation, but also quite optimistic, because this really will represent a significant change in tone, tenor, and approach from the Trump administration.
And I very much agree with you, actually, on what you just said about also the German readout not mentioning China. I mean, it was interesting. We just had this morning an exchange with the Portuguese foreign minister, Portugal is currently in charge of the EU presidency, the rotating presidency for the next 6 months, and the foreign minister was just in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. And I think it was only despite the fact that I think if not every single MEP, or at least 90% of them, asked questions related to China, I think in the end he only mentioned China explicitly at the very end. I think in the last 2 minutes, and you're absolutely right that there is this absolute hesitancy in Europe to mention the C word. But at the same time, we also have, we had from Joseph Borrell, the High Representative, we also had this idea of a EU-US dialogue on China. And that actually brings me to Niklas, because all eyes are now turned on the Biden administration, on DC, how Washington what it will bring to the table to reinvigorate transatlantic relations. But it takes two to tango, and it's also a question of what Europe is willing to bring to the table. I mean, we already had also before Christmas the paper from the European Commission outlining its priorities for a transatlantic agenda. We have also statements from the European Parliament, from the member states. So my question is, also to you, what can Europe bring to the table over the next few years? And do you think in some ways, because at the moment we see certainly a lot of excitement for transatlantic relations, but do you think some of that can perhaps evaporate? Do you think we'll see soon, actually, that will turn into some kind of frustration, like we've seen in the early Obama years after much excitement of the initial months? So I'd like to actually hear your take on what do you think Europe can bring, and how actually it can be more active to reinvigorate transatlantic relations, whether to have, whether it comes to NATO, or certainly when it comes to specific issues like the challenge of China?
I think there's several things that like Europe can bring on the table. I mean, foremost, obviously, I mean, continuing to demonstrate that it is an active and above all like valuable ally like to the United States that can add value to the US like network of alliances. And what that means is that like when there are kind of issues that are of importance like to the United States, I mean, which might not be at the same level necessarily for all Europeans, I mean, still like find ways to work together with the United States, perhaps not always kind of seeing eye to eye, but still like working hand in hand. I think like one key thing is that we need to also, as Europeans, like meet the Biden administration's like goodwill gestures, like towards Europe with equal gestures like towards them. What could that be? I mean, I think things like, I mean, participating like actively in the proposed Summit for Democracies, I mean, will be key, I think. Like, although, I mean, just listening to different European capitals, I think Europe is still quite far from making up its collective mind of what it thinks of this conference. I mean, there are kind of some who are rather excited and some who are a little bit more on the, let's say, skeptical side, because and they oppose it for this, well, not oppose it, but they have reservations for the same reason and that they had when McCain came up with something similar when he was a presidential candidate like some years ago. I think another key thing in addition to the summit is it's a related thing, and it's the challenge of China that we already spoke about. And if you listen to the Senate hearing of Secretary of Defense of the new Secretary of Defense, like Lloyd Austin, that Biden nominated, it's very clear that like China will be at the top like of the defense agenda, like also for also for this administration, like going forward. And I think this is absolutely vital for the Europeans to recognize that like and to ensure that like even though like we might want to be a little bit more hesitant when it comes to our China policy here because of the simple fact that like Europe, like the trade relationship between Europe and China is very different to the one between like China and the United States, I mean, which often like keeps coming up in these discussions. China and the challenge it poses will continue to shape the transatlantic relationship and NATO, like perhaps more than any other challenge like going forward. And it's absolutely key for Europeans to like come to terms with that. I think then related to this, like holding more like high level like discussions also on the purpose of like NATO and the transatlantic relationship on different levels, I think will be key going forward. I mean, last year, like we heard in like things like President Macron of France, like labeling NATO as brain dead. There was an interesting exchange between Macron and the German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, coming from like very different perspectives on the transatlantic relationship and the US role when it comes to the defense of Europe. And you can be on whatever side of these kind of debates and arguments, but what they do think is that they help, they put the issue of the transatlantic relationship and the future of NATO at the very top of the political agenda, like to the highest levels of decision making. And then ministers, like leaders, they will have to kind of spend time engaging on these topics and trying to kind of come to terms like themselves as well, like what NATO, what the transatlantic relationship like means for them. And I think this is absolutely crucial. One other thing I think is like joint efforts like on like climate and green energy, like which were kind of like mentioned already. And I think this is as well, like going forward, like there's going to be huge room like within the transatlantic relationship to organize like more cooperative efforts, not just like to tackle climate change, but also make sure that like then like the technologies that are developed and the technologies that are needed to address the issue of climate change in the future, like will like emerge and within the transatlantic area, and benefit the businesses on both sides of the continent. So I think that will be like absolutely key. And it's interesting to see like how the markets have reacted like since Biden was elected. I mean, if you have a look at like some of like clean energy companies in the US or Europe as well, like I mean, they share prices like jumped, skyrocketed. I mean, since the election, and they have continued to rise. So I think there's a lot of expectations on both sides of the Atlantic that I mean there will be very important movement in this area as well.
Absolutely. Or if you haven't bought your shares yet in NL or some other energy company currently investing into green energy, do it before it's too late, because I think there's certainly money to be made there, especially if you want to buy a house these days, which is not so easy. But I mean, I have actually a question for you regarding specifically what you said, what you talked about, Niklas, about this political role for NATO. And I want to ask you both about that, but I see we have a question from Andrzej Olshansky, who wants to ask a question on China, because I know this is an issue on everyone's mind at the moment. So maybe if I give the floor to Andrzej to ask his question, and all of you, please feel free to either submit or to write to me if you want to ask questions. We're more than welcome. We're very interested to hear from you. And if I can also ask you before you ask your question to also introduce yourself so we know who you are. Andrzej, over to you.
Hi, I'm Andrzej Olshansky, a security policy analyst from Czech Republic, and patron here at Atlantic Forum. I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts on Chinese policy regarding, well, to be honest, I think that the way previous United States administration engaged China was not in its roots very bad move. I think regarding Chinese new upscale neo-colonialism and very much profound divide et impera policy, I think for Europe to survive, it is an impediment to engage China, on its own terms, especially regarding foreign direct investment screening mechanisms and much more profound corporate responsibility laws and judicatures. Well, when we see the newly instated policies in the United States regarding their foreign direct investment screening and their ban on certain Chinese companies and partial ban on Chinese stocks, I think the European Union needs to act accordingly with the United States on this matter. I have been very saddened to see the new trade agreement pass, because I think that here is very interesting to say or to remember the words that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, of Lenin, said, that the capitalists will sell us the rope that we will hang them on. And this is especially the thing that Chinese really wants now. So I would like to ask you about the thing that the NATO should also consider financial warfare as a new battleground or a new prospective area of engagement. What are your views on such things? Thank you.
Thanks, Andrzej. And that's a very, certainly at the moment with the investment agreement between the EU and China, that's certainly a very legitimate question, and certainly given the eyebrows it raised also, well, not just in Washington, but actually even among many people who were surprised to see it being concluded at the speed at which it was just before Christmas. So I think it's a fully legitimate question. I mean, Carisa, maybe I'll start with you if you would like to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's pivotal here is NATO EU cooperation. So I, for one, don't think that NATO is the central forum to be creating investment screening mechanisms. I still think that all of that in terms of competency rests with the EU. But what I do think is pivotal is more cooperation. I mean, as you rightly point out, this is an adversary, I think the United States would consider an adversary, maybe not, all of Europe, but this is an adversary whose advantage is economic statecraft. If we try to compare this to the Cold War, to Russia, I mean, the United States was not really quaking in its boots about the Soviet economy. This is an adversary who utilizes and promotes its military-civil fusion policy to intentionally blur those lines between military and economic power. as well as commercial interests. So I think what we have to see is that a lot of the risk assessments need to be generated within NATO. I think that NATO should be setting the risk assessment and should be cooperating with the EU. And I think a lot of the reflection groups observations and potential ideas for this, including some, permanent liaisons on the NATO international staff, as well as within the EEAS of the EU, is a great first step here. I think that there has to be more communication between the two actors so that the EU is really able to take NATO's risk assessment, from a military national security perspective, which critical technologies pose a threat to NATO intelligence, to NATO communication structures, and how can the EU be designing policies, designing, assessments, as they did with 5G, as they've done with the investment screenings and kind of their guidelines moving forward on those. And they should be taking NATO's assessments as a starting point for all of those conversations, because I think that those military equities in this issue have been totally overlooked in the EU, not totally, but largely overlooked in the EU. And I think that that's a really great first step, as there has to be more coordination and cooperation between the two bodies.
And I mean, Niklas, maybe also, if I can also just build on Andrei's question and what Carisa said, I mean, the other issue we have seems to be certainly on the European side, is that also when we look at, for example, annual reports from intelligence agencies who do not shy away from naming China as a threat when it comes to the political level, to the governments, to the member states, and certainly on the EU level. Also, we seem to be a lot more careful in terms of how we frame this our relations with China, and actually the phrasing is becoming a bit of a dance at the moment. So I wonder also, from what Carisa said, I mean, at the same time, we need to address this challenge, but we seem even unable to call it a security threat, or to even figure out actually what we want to do. I mean, on one hand, we keep talking about cooperation, but then we keep talking about the geopolitical challenge, the issues with Chinese investments in Europe, but also in areas where the EU has clear interest, like the Eastern neighborhood, Balkans, so on. So I wonder, I mean, how do you think we can actually build a common perception of the challenge of China?
Well, it's a great question, and I think kind of exactly like you mentioned. I mean, like if you have a look at the policy documents now, I mean, China is both a systemic rival and a partner, and there's a whole bunch of different terms that are used to refer to it. So the issue is by no means clear at the moment, and I think kind of the clearest statement for China's strategy, I mean, that we've heard is the Sinatra doctrine from Borrell, or the Economist initially, which basically means is that Europe wants to develop a China policy that would allow it to go on China on its own, basically. And what does that mean? I mean, it just means that Europe has its own autonomous China policy. I mean, that's not a strategy. I mean, that's the starting point of potentially creating a strategy, or perhaps not. The problem is that we see that because of Europe simply doesn't view China as a threat to the same extent, I think, than the United States. I mean, partly because we don't have equal the same kind of presence and interest in the Asia Pacific region, and most European countries do not have a presence or role in that region, or the ability to project power or have a security relationship with countries like Taiwan, for example. But the key now is that, like I said before as well, I mean, for the United States, the issue of China will continue to be at the top of its agenda, going forward. And I think that is something that would not change. I mean, regardless of who would even be the next president after Biden, and whether the White House is controlled by a Democrat or a Republican. So I'm not sure if Europe at the moment is able to develop an effective common China strategy, but then we have to ask, I mean, what are the dangers and risks, I mean, if it doesn't? And I think that is the decline of the transatlantic relationship and NATO. I mean, let's face it. I mean, because I mean, the Americans don't. I mean, the Americans are, of course, like worried by Russia, like the traditional adversary of NATO that NATO seeks to deter. But I mean, if NATO cannot adopt, and if Europeans like cannot like develop an effective common position that would allow them to be more operational as an ally, like with the Americans, I mean, when it comes to addressing like different aspects of the China relationship, I mean, I think then like very quickly the Biden administration as well, I mean, they will like start asking, I mean, what is the practical value of these European allies? I mean, if they are not willing to support our aims, and we have to be very, very careful about that, I think.
Indeed. And well, let's see how that develops, because there's a lot of excitement at the moment, which is great to see. But I think you're right to say that we also need to manage expectations, and certainly it's important for the two sides to finally have a sit down at the table and actually discuss their common approach, which I think is absolutely important. And even within Europe to do that. I mean, we see, you know, the way, for example, the Lithuanians on one hand are approaching the challenge of China. On the other hand, we see Germany or some of the other states with their approach. And so I think we have certainly a long way to go. But actually, that brings me to another question, which regarding the reflection group. I mean, the reflection group in its 2030 paper talked about the need for NATO to play a more political role. And I'm just very curious actually to hear from both of you, what do you think about this? I mean, in what way do you think NATO can play a more political role, and or vice versa? Do you actually think that NATO actually is the wrong format for political discussions? And or if you do think, in fact, that NATO should indeed play this political role, also as Ulrik talked, to have a serious discussion about our values and to what extent we are prepared to defend them, then how should this discussion actually look, in your opinion? I don't know, whichever wants to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. So, part of this dovetails on the points I had made earlier about EU-China cooperation. I think that especially if we're looking at some of those external threats, that will be absolutely pivotal. Again, I don't think that NATO is the essential forum for some of these questions, but I do think it should be setting the agenda, setting the tone, and most importantly, setting the risk assessment. On the democratic values piece, though, I believe NATO absolutely has to take a political role here. I think that EU coordination will again play a big role, and I think that cooperation on this, so that as the EU is already monitoring member states through rule of law monitoring mechanisms, I think that there should be open coordination between a developed new person in NATO who is really responsible. I know that in the past this has been mentioned as maybe an ombudsperson. I think the reflection group sees this a little bit differently, but I think that is really pivotal, is to strengthen those mechanisms. One thing I was a little bit disheartened about in the reflection group paper was this focus on external threats. There was a big discussion about focusing and creating a potential center of excellence for democratic resilience to strengthen societal resilience to resist hostile external actors. We don't need to look any further than the events in the United States on January 6th to see that there are significant problems across the alliance, and it's not just external threats that are causing those problems, that these are really emanating from within domestic governments and actors. And I think that NATO, while this is not necessarily totally in their lane, does need to be doing some work to both, deal with external threats, external actors, as it always has, but also to deal with member states internally, and to be able to, as we say in the United States, walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to, NATO has to be able to do both. Historically, this has been handled in the alliance through bilateral pressure. So that's how we saw this play out with military dictatorships in Turkey and in Greece in the past. You know, this works to an extent, but I think that this mostly worked when we were talking about one actor on the off chance who is causing some problems in the alliance and might have a dictatorship in place. This was not when we're looking at 3 actors within the alliance, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, 4 if we include some of the United States' democratic backsliding in the past couple of years, including, you know, some eventual problems that we might see in the Czech Republic as we have a personalist party and leader in place there. So I think that NATO has to be able to grapple with this. One recommendation that I've always loved, but this might fall kind of on Ulrik's trade-off of bold versus realistic, is potentially implementing some kind of EU qualified majority type voting within the alliance. You know, this is of course really difficult to pull off because who do you have to have approval from to do that? The members in NATO. So I do think that, you know, that's one idea and one thing that we should be considering. I do think that the reflection group really gets right that there has to be deeper cooperation between NATO and the EU on these issues, and that, you know, because this is the EU's wheelhouse and they have these monitoring mechanisms in place, that can really help NATO, but there should be some kind of coordination between the two on that front. So in short, yes, there is a political role for NATO, and NATO does have to walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of dealing with external threats to democracy and those emanating from within the alliance.
Sure. Niklas?
Yes, so I think also, like, I mean, there is obviously a political role for NATO to play, and I mean that comes like from the simple fact that, I mean, like all the like threats and challenges that NATO faces are by nature also political, and what that means is that the alliance like needs to have at the political level, I mean, discuss various different political levels. I mean, discussions on the current and future challenges that that NATO is facing, and to keep the vibrancy and the unity of the alliance like in stock, and preserve it all the time. But in addition to that, I mean, I think it's good to have like some kind of like values based like political role for NATO. I mean, you often hear it said that NATO wasn't created as a kind of values-based or a democratic alliance. I mean, which is true, but I mean, at the moment, I think part of what the alliance is about kind of protecting democratic, like law-abiding countries, like in the North Atlantic region, and although there are like some of those countries that are NATO members that have done like slight backsliding in these areas like over the past years, like very regrettably, I think that's still very fundamentally like part of NATO's DNA and like what the alliance is about. So like going forward, and with Biden in the White House, I think Europeans as well, I mean, could try to work towards like some sort of like more like values-based role for NATO, a values statement, perhaps, while working towards the new strategic concept. And I think this would be also very beneficial for the European Union, because it would kind of provide support for the EU's ongoing rule of law efforts, and put them on a stronger foundation within the Transatlantic Alliance as well.
I mean, do you think it would also actually help the strategic concept if, in some ways, also the European Union finally defines actually what it means by strategic autonomy? Do you think this has a role to play here as well, to understand the way the two actors can work together and interact? Because I mean, you and I had plenty of discussions over beer on Twitter about strategic autonomy, and there's always a lively discussion, but it also seems that really strategic autonomy has just become sort of an all things to all people. So, do you think it would also help, even if we're talking about the political dimension, for the EU to actually be clear about what it means by it, and thereby to also explain to its allies what this means and the impact for NATO?
Yes, so I absolutely think that it would make it a little bit easier, at least, for the European Union to like communicate like its ambitions. I mean, if it defined like strategic autonomy like explicitly and clearly, and like it, rather than like continuing with this pervasive ambiguity about like the different aspects of the concept and like what it actually means. And I think it's pretty clear that, I mean, at this, in the security and defense field, it means like the EU's ability to act independently, like if necessary, but in cooperation with its allies. I mean, if possible, like to take care of security and defense like challenges primarily in its own neighborhood. I mean, that's, I think, the definite, like how I understand the concept in the security and defense field. The challenge like now is that the concept of strategic autonomy has become like so much broader like in the last couple of years, and especially under the current von der Leyen Commission. Like, I mean, we hear about strategic autonomy in the digital sphere, like we hear about open strategic autonomy in the area of like external trade, and everything is suddenly about strategic autonomy, and I think this is like somewhat like problematic for the Union, because there are some countries like who seek to advance like a rather kind of restrictive, I would even say protectionist kind of view on strategic autonomy when it comes to issues like trade and the digital sphere. But then there are like others like who would want to see a more kind of open and accessible Europe based on like the principles of like free market that they've been championing like for years. But I mean, this is a debate that, I mean, Europeans like need to have. And I think one possibility to kind of also make a bit more sense of the concept of strategic autonomy, and also like then connect it a little bit better with the strategic concept in NATO, is the ongoing process of developing a strategic compass for the European Union. The strategic compass is a new tool that is meant to provide a little bit more guidance and coherence to the EU security and defense policy, and it will be drafted this year by the External Action Service and the member states, and then adopted under the French presidency in 2022. It's like it was initially supposed to be called the strategic concept as well, but then the Germans like who came up with this like were a little bit cautious, because I mean they didn't want to duplicate like NATO language like in the EU context. So the idea is it's basically that it's also going to be kind of a path showing document for the European Union. And we don't yet know exactly, like, I mean, what the timeline for this new strategic concept would be. But I mean, if the leaders approve the development, I mean, later this year, then I mean, presumably there will be at least a little bit of overlap between the strategic concept and the strategic compass. And given that the two institutions, NATO and the European Union, like they're based in the same city, a little bit in different parts, but I think there should be like very effective coordination as much as possible.
Absolutely. And as it actually reminds me of a favorite saying of one of my old professors, who used to say, you know, you may not be interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics is certainly interested in you. And for too long, actually, we seem to ignore actually the reality. The geopolitics is still out there. We behaved, we like to think that, you know, the whole world is living in this Kantian dream that happened after the Cold War, but of course, that was no longer the case. And I mean, the European neighborhood slowly being engulfed in flames in the east, in the south. The rise of China, other authoritarian regimes, terrorism, instability in the Sahel, piracy. Many different issues and many different challenges we all have to face, and quite frankly, we do have to face them together, because you know, divided we are weaker, but working together we are stronger and able to and more able to address many of these challenges. So on that note, I will also slowly conclude, and first of all, let me apologize to all of you for the initial technical issues, which I hope we've now managed to fix. We have also recorded the session as well, so you're more than welcome to, if you found this session stimulated, then feel free to watch it again and inspire yourselves. Also, we are going to, as I said, this is the first in a series of discussions we are going to run at the Atlantic Forum over the next few months, and we're going to have the next discussion focused on China specifically, on how we can actually develop a common transatlantic approach. So please join us for that. And in the next few months also, we hope to have additional further discussions also focusing on challenges facing NATO and transatlantic area on the southern flank, the eastern flank, the future of our engagement in Afghanistan, hybrid threats, and many other issues that we need to face. But let me more than anything thank Carisa, Niklas, and Ulrik, who although isn't with us anymore, but he's still with us at least in spirit. So thank you very much to all three of you. It's been a real pleasure to have you, to be able to catch up with you. I hope next time we do that, we also are able to grab a beer together afterwards, because it's certainly about time to do that. Let me also thank to all the guests who eventually managed to log in. Apologize to you as well for the technical hitch, and I sincerely look forward to continue this discussion and welcoming you all back again soon. And thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Igor, and many thanks to the Atlantic Forum as well.
Thanks, Niklas.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Carisa.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion, guys. Hope to see you soon.